Ladies and gentlemen, let's for a Gaming Tentacom video. We're going to be doing an analysis of the Order 1886 GDC 2014 presentations. This is going to be part 1, and there is a link in the description which I'd recommend you click on if you want a more in-depth analysis on stuff. Plus as well, there are screenshots from the slides, links, and other shiny things as well in there. Now be warned, some of this stuff does get very complicated, and I'm probably going to have to explain some stuff on the way. I'm also going to assume that you have a basic understanding of the PlayStation 4's basic architecture, for example, how compute runs on it, the memory layout and stuff like that, because I don't want to re-go over everything that I've, gone over infinity times by now. So if you're not too sure how this stuff works, you can either check out my channel, or you can Google it yourself, or whatever really makes you happy. So with that said, let's get into it. So the Order 1886 is of course set in an alternative 19th century, and I actually really like this because when I first saw the trailer of it, it really reminded me of some type of steampunk horror title. It's like, well, this gets my interest very piqued, because I'm hugely into the steampunk thing. I'm not like massive nerd into it, but I'm pretty into it, and horror is definitely one of my favourite genres of gaming. So, we've already taken a look previously at the first part of the infamous Second Son post-mortem, also from GDC. Now, in case you're wondering, by the way guys, sorry, every time I move my chair it squeaks, I'm going to forget some oil. But, I've already done part 1 of that, and I was going to do part 2, but then I thought to myself, well, people have also been asking me about the Order, so I figure at least get them to roughly the same point where we go over the basic engine, how it works, and then I also need to go over one other thing concerning the GCN architecture, ROPS, and other bits and pieces as well that you guys have linked to me. Then I can finish off the infamous, is basically what it comes down to. I just want to at least get us all onto the same page. So anyway, the purpose of the Order is that they were going for massive visual fidelity. They wanted the PS4 to look absolutely beautiful. The title to look absolutely beautiful. So they're actually using an in-house engine. And believe it or not, they started with only 2 graphics artists. Now, there have been some complaints leveled concerning the Order 1886, primarily in the direction the developers have gone for the visual artistic style. Basically, Ready of Dawn have gone with full 1080p but with large black bars. Now, for those of you who are really paying attention, that really doesn't mean 1080p. It actually works out, because of the size of the bars, to be 1920 by 800, roughly anyway. And that means that you're going to be reducing the workload, because obviously, showing a bunch of black pixels on a, bar isn't really particularly strenuous on the GPU. So you're basically reducing the workload by just over 30% on the GPU compared to a full 1080p image. Now, I've covered this in detail previously, so you could check that out. There's a link to that in the article. But it's also worth mentioning that they're going to be using 4 times MSAA, that's multi-sample anti-aliasing, which is rather expensive. In actuality, it's actually fairly rare to get that with console games. Most of the time it's FXAA, which is like a post-processing effect. But in this case, they've actually said that running a 1080 by 800 with the 4 times MSAA is far more expensive in terms of performance than what it would be if they were to go with like FXAA at like 1920 by 1080. So anyway, they're also targeting 30 frames per second. The purpose behind that is to basically give them more time to render each frame of animation. Just think of it this way, that per frame of animation, the GPU needs to basically go through multiple passes, needs to do multiple jobs, basically, to get the image ready. So, effectively speaking, the lower the frame rate, the longer the GPU has to work on a particular frame of animation. So, for example, in the case of this, 30 FPS gives you double the amount of time over 60. So while a lot of PC purists, of course, will point out that 60 is the minimum, unfortunately on a fixed platform such as a console, you've only got a finite amount of performance. Obviously the AMD GCN GPU is providing about 1.84 teraflops of computing power, and so to get this title running at 60 FPS isn't really going to be happening, to be honest, unless they were willing to drastically reduce the visual fidelity. Now, interestingly enough, the team do somewhat point out a few interesting caveats. Now, first of all, it's Windows 11, DX11, shall I say, in PS4, but heavily geared towards the PS4, shall I point out. This refers to the graphical effects. So in other words, they're basically DX11 based, but it's heavily optimized and pushed towards the PlayStation 4 platform. And they are using fine-grained task scheduling. Now, just in case you're not too familiar with what that means, fine-grained, well, in this case, grained refers to granularity. In other words, how broken the task is into either smaller or large chunks. So, for example, in this case, it's small sizes. This means that there's much greater scope for parallelism because it can run on pretty much any available process, because obviously it's fairly small. The chunk of data, so it could be pushed to multiple cores and easier to spread around, if you will, much greater, easier to multi-thread. The problem is it also means it's a lot more difficult to code, and it also requires extra memory bandwidth and communication. So there's that. Low overhead multi-threaded command buffer, in case you're unfamiliar with what that means, a generation. This requires well, low overhead I think is fairly obvious. It doesn't really require too much resources. Multi-threaded basically means rather than it just utilizing, say, one CPU, it could go over as many as required. And the last part, command buffer generation, this is basically for GPU commands. So in other words, what it has to process on the graphics core. PS4 secret source is not elaborated upon, at least as far as I've found yet. And obviously they're kind of, I would imagine, pointing out to the unified memory, pointing out that, obviously they're fully utilizing that as well as compute. And they're also utilizing a physically based rendering. They set out to use that. So this basically means how light materials interact with one another, because obviously various objects have different opacities, translucencies, different levels of reflection, and so on and so on. So as I mentioned, originally they just had 2 programmers. Now they've got 5 for the graphics, and work began in early 2011. So they're mostly using Maya 2014 and C++ with the workflow. Not very much of a surprise, if I do say so myself. And obviously, once again, it's focused on being multi-threaded. And the idea is that they want to be able to use Maya and other applications to basically just live edit the assets, so they can preview new textures, materials, particle systems, whatever they need to do as and when it's going on. So let's move on to memory. So the PlayStation 4 does have 8GB of GDDR5. I don't think I need to tell any of you that, but as we've discussed heavily previously, there's a link in the article, or you could just search Sucker Punch GDC or Sucker Punch, Infamous Second Son. What would you have to search? Sucker Punch or Infamous Second Son on the channel, along with Postmortem, and it will pop right up. But as we've discussed heavily with that, you don't get full access to all of the memory because a lot of it is reserved for the OS. Now in this case, about 4.5 gigs are being utilized. Textures, the initial main textures of like the world, that type of thing, are taking up about 2 GB of memory, which is quite expensive, to say the least. And it might sound a lot, but when you consider that, for example, the standard tiling texture of the world is like 1024 by 1024, you can start to see how if they're using like RGB A8 or something similar, it's going to become quite expensive in the memory. So it's also important to realize that they're not referring to megabytes when it comes to like 128. So if I do slip up and I say megabyte, I'm actually screwing up on when I'm referring to their specs. It's actually not supposed to be megabytes, it's mebi. I think that's how you pronounce it anyway. But anyway, I always pronounce it mebi. Mebibyte. That's M-E-B-I byte. B-Y-T-E. Now, I'm not going to give you an in-depth explanation as to what the difference is between an MB and a MIB, because it's quite complicated and it would run me several minutes. All you need to know is that a MIB is slightly larger than an MB for the purposes of this. You can do your own research if you so wish. I've also given you a link in the article which goes to a calculator, so you can check that out if you so desire. But basically the rule of thumb is that it's about 1.05 times larger. So let's assume you have 100 MIBs. That comes to about 105 megabytes. It's ever so slightly under, but pretty much you could just go 1.05, right? So if you were to, for example, take the 2,378 MIBs, combine that with the 2 gigabytes of texture budget, that gives you about the 4.5 gigabyte mark. So there you have that. It's unsurprising that they've used so much of it. 128 is used for sound. There's 700 reserved for level geometry, which obviously is, you know, how the worlds are made. Character textures are expensive, and we'll go into why in just a moment. But that's 600 MIBs. I was about to say megabytes, MIBs, and 250 is for like global textures. These are like for light maps, UI, that type of thing. It's important to realize that the characters have light maps, and there is a freaking lot of lighting in this game. And honestly, some of the mathematics in this are extremely complicated. I actually had to get a little bit of outside help for some of this because some of their reflections and stuff were really ridiculously complicated. But I managed to break down a lot of it for you guys. 700 megabytes, MIBs was also required for animation. Incidentally, when you consider just how much animation a character has, and you've got to remember that a character has like a lot of different assets. For example, if they're moving, if they're running, if they have, oh, I don't know, they're speaking, different speaking animations, you know, if they're maybe having an idle pose, and every character has this, and it's not just 1 or 2 frames of animation. You've got to have one, you know, so it's all smooth. So that's why that becomes so expensive, particularly for more complicated models with like a lot of detail. Obviously, you know, the different fingers and stuff all require animations, and that's why that starts to add up very quickly. It used to be that animation was actually fairly cheap in terms of size, but now it's becoming extremely expensive. And this was also synonymous with Infamous Second Son. If one was hoping to see the render targets for the Order 1886, one would be most upset, because unfortunately they've not got them listed. Infamous Second Son had 290 megabytes dedicated towards render targets, but there was quite a few people who questioned, well, how much optimization was there actually on the behalf of Sucker Punch regarding the memory budgets of this, and they obviously, you know, it was fine for them, but there's not really any mention of that. They've just kind of given this overall global breakdown, which I feel is a little bit of a shame. But, you know, that's what we've got to work with. So anyway, they are using a form of forward lighting. They're actually using tiled forward rendering, also known to its friends, buddies, and besties as Forward Plus. That's not P-L-U-S, that's actually with the plus symbol. So Forward Plus is actually kind of an evolution of the traditional forward rendering. A lot of games use traditional forward rendering, particularly older titles, and this mostly goes back to how graphics cards used to work, particularly before GPU, or actually more to the point, before the more open approach. Now, of course, you don't really have like a fixed function so much. A lot of this goes back to that. Now, of course, a shader is kind of a shader, and it can do a lot more. So basically, you provide the geometry of the scene, it's broken down to vertices, and then eventually these are lit up, right? This is for like traditional forward rendering, and then these are lit up with multiple passes or singular pass depending on how complicated that scene is. Forward plus is pretty much the similar thing, but there are some differences. For example, it also has light culling. This basically creates a list of lights which are visible and what's doing what, and then it's passed over to the final render shader, so like the final scene. The basic premise here is that it reduces memory bandwidth usage, it improves performance, and it also helps to reduce the restriction on like material and lighting and stuff that's typically been associated with forward rendering. It's still pretty expensive, however, but they're doing a pretty good job explaining it. Anyway, there's also a lot of shader work in the title. GGX, which is a lighting model, that's extremely that goes into quite in-depth in quite an in-depth topic, so I'll let you Google that, or you can follow the link, it's up to you. So the team actually point that the lighting of this is ridiculously, ludicrously complicated. It requires a lot of mathematics, and that's really what a lot of this stuff breaks down to at the end of the day. It's like math. And they point out that it's luckily that they've got a lot of ALUs to work with, or ALU, by the way, stands for Arithmetic Logic Units, which basically handle the mathematic operations on either a GPU or CPU. Most likely in this case it's a GPU that's handling all of this. So in other words, mathematics are passed on to that, and then it's calculated for it on behalf of the PlayStation 4 as a whole. Now, let's get on to the skin shader, which is apparently the most expensive shader that they run in the actual game. Now, this is extremely complicated mathematics here, and I actually got the help with someone who's taking a mathematics degree on this, because my maths are not that great. I'm actually trying to brush up on them, if I'm totally honest. And I'm not going to mention their name, because they, quite frankly, don't want me to mention it on the internet. So, I shall say to them as thank you very much. But basically, the skin SH refers to lighting and methods of the skin. Now, this is confirming pretty much what I assumed anyway, but it's good just to have a bit of confirmation, because obviously we don't have access to some of the lecture and some of the notes. So basically how this works is it calculates the reflection of light on the skin based upon the angle it's coming from. So think about it this way: your skin is not a flat surface. It might look it, but anyone who looks at the skin fairly closely, you can see that you've got pores of skin, and where the hair's popping up if you've just recently shaved, or you might have a scar there or whatever, and all of this pretty much interferes with how your skin is going to look under different lighting conditions. And so they've got mathematics in there to, well, basically calculate that. And then what they do is they use a sphere-based system. They take the previous mapping techniques, and then they use this basically lighting as basically spheres rather than a simple flat surface. And the theory behind that is to reduce the weird shades of on the characters. Now, this is based on a paper, and I've linked that in there. Be warned, it is extremely technical, and so it's a fascinating read, but I'm just warning you guys, you might not just be prepared, basically. So character hair is not physically based. They've pointed that out. They've not had time either to try out the real-time Marshner, which is a real-time hair simulation and shading system. I've once again linked that in the article. They are pushing the realism of the hair by adding multiple lighting shaders and basically figuring out how that will react in different environments. Now, a lot of this is getting complicated, but suffice to say, it's extremely important to get hair looking good, because figure it this way: your hair will not only react differently, and by react differently I mean react as in terms of wind, and your own head movements. It's gonna, if you're moving your hair head side to side, particularly if you've got long hair, obviously your hair is gonna alter with that, particularly if you're also influencing it with outside forces, in other words, wind, smoke, that type of thing. But also if it's wet, and also if you've got, say, reflections off of it, and all light causes reflections, and your hair color, along with the lighting around you and many other different examples, will all make your hair look different. So, for example, if you've got long hair and highlights, let's say you've got dark hair and highlights, your hair is going to look very different in light to someone who's just got, like myself, got dark hair, or someone who's blonde, or say, for example, if we're standing in the rain and then we were to move on to, inside, all of it is very different. So it's just something to bear in mind. A lot of this is very difficult to approximate. If you'd like more information, I've also given you a link to Real-Time Marshner, the actual website, and you can check that out. And I've also given you a link in the article to TressFX 2. You could also search TressFX on this channel, and you'll pop up with a lot of information regarding AMD's TressFX, which is basically based on the same thing. TressFX, incidentally, also works on more than just hair. It also works on for things such as grass and foliage, that type of thing. But primarily, it's focused on hair. And that's about it for this particular video, actually. It's been fairly lengthy to calculate all this stuff and to kind of do it all for you, so hopefully you've enjoyed it. It's not usually as lengthy as most of my post-mortem things, but frankly, it is... What time is it here in the UK? It's almost 9 PM, and I still need to edit, finalize this, and finish the article, upload it, and basically prepare myself for work in the morning, which I have ridiculously early. So I will bid ye farewell. As I said, there will be part 2 of the Infamous coming up. I'm also going to be finishing or starting the GCN architecture as well. There will be some more interviews coming up on the channel and some other shiners. But for right now, I'm going to let you guys go. So hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.